I thought this was gonna be cute, but I'm pretty sure I look like a Who from Whoville. Okie dokie. Okie dokie. So, welcome back to my jungle. If you are watching my video right now, it would be incredibly, unbelievably helpful if you could subscribe, like this video, more importantly, comment on this video. The engagement on these videos is what's gonna really help out my channel. So today, I thought I would talk about mixing your own soil. I know that there's quite a number of videos on YouTube that help give you information on mixing your own soil for indoor plants. I found when I was first starting to have an interest in mixing my own soil for my indoor plants that I found it very hard to find any Australian resources or Australian videos that included Australian products. So although the information that I'm sharing is going to be quite universal, I think that it's going to give a little extra help to my Aussie friends that would like some specific ideas on what to buy and what to use. But I think I'll probably... Oh, I love living on a highway. So the first ingredient or product that I want to talk about for my indoor plant soil mixture is peat or peat moss. I want to start with this one because I know that there's a little bit of controversy behind this product. They probably use more peat than any other one product, so I think I'll start with that. Okay, so peat moss itself is decomposed organic material. Specifically, that's often sphagnum moss or other mosses. Mossi? That's not a word. Mosses. Okay, let's go with that. So in that sense, it's a little bit similar to compost, as in that compost is a decomposed organic matter. The difference being that peat moss is decomposed sphagnum moss or other moss, and that compost would need air or oxygen to actually decompose its material, whereas peat moss requires there to be no air or oxygen present for it to decompose. Peat moss is considered to have a slightly high pH, or it's slightly acidic, which some plants love and thrive on. Plants like African violets and some ferns. Not plants that I have a lot of, quite frankly. Peat moss soaks about 20 times its weight in water, which is great for plants that like to be a little bit more moist. The problem with peat moss is that it does take a long time to let go of that water, so it is holding onto water for quite a long time on its own, which isn't ideal because that situation can lead to root rot, which in my experience is the biggest killer and the hardest issue to come back from. Peat moss on its own has a very small amount of nutrients for a plant. It has very minimal beneficial microorganisms for your plant to create nutrients and absorb those nutrients. So by itself, it's not going to give your plant enough sustenance to thrive. The controversial side of peat moss is its unsustainability. I read that it takes about 25 years to renew a harvest and to be able to harvest again, which obviously is not a quick, renewable, sustainable option. But as well as that, the mining process of this peat moss, which is usually done in Canada, in the bogs as far as I understand, when they mine this product, it releases a huge amount of carbon into the atmosphere from the bogs, and it continues to release this carbon into the atmosphere long after being harvested. So I understand why peat moss isn't everyone's favorite choice, and trust me when I say it's not mine either. When I first started mixing my own soil mix, I would use coco coir, which I found to be a really fantastic product. I loved everything about it. Even just the color and the feel of the product was so rich. It's another truck. Let's wait for the truck to go past. Yep. Anyway, originally I was using coco coir. I can no longer find coco coir at Bunnings like I used to. I used to buy it in a 30 litre bag, and it wasn't dehydrated into a brick like the cocoa peat is. It was loose, it was very red and vibrant, and it smelled earthy and wonderful, and it felt soft and velvety. I really loved that product, but not long after, you know, March or April in 2020, I've never been able to find that product again. But if you can find coco coir, I highly suggest coco coir over peat moss. The coco coir is a waste product of already processing coconuts in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, and coconuts are far more renewable and such a vast resource compared to peat moss. It has a neutral pH, which is the desired level for most indoor plants. It also contains these high amounts of lignin and cellulose, which help from decomposing and shrinking every time it's been watered, unlike peat moss. The thing with coco coir that I guess does rub me the wrong way is that it's assumed that peat moss is an environmental demon, and that coco coir is a bit of an angel sent from the heavens. In terms of sustainability and the effect on the ecosystem, coco coir is a little bit more debated. While yes, coconuts are far more accessible and quick and easy to grow compared to the peat moss and the bogs in Canada, the way that the coconut is processed is that originally it sat in water for quite a long time to get the fibers away from the coconut, and that was done on really ripe coconuts. But as the demand has risen, growers haven't been able to wait until the coconuts are fully ripe like they used to be able to. So with a fully ripe coconut, that would then sit in water and the fibers would be extracted and that would be processed and used for coco coir. Now, because there's such a high turnover, to have the same effect on unripe coconut so that you can pick that earlier, that then has to be soaked in brine. And brine compared to water, brine is obviously going to have a much higher salt content, which those minerals are still going to exist in the coco coir that you're planting your plants in. So it's something to be really aware of. As well as the fact that the process of obtaining this coco coir from these coconuts, it takes a lot of water, which is quite a valuable resource. It's already a limited source in India. So all I'm saying is, in terms of sustainability and ethics and the ecosystem, I don't feel like we should be putting all our eggs in one basket just because peat moss is the most obvious villain. Anyway, that's all I have to say about those products. I think they're the most controversial in this video, so I'm glad that's over with. So the next product that I'm going to talk about is horticultural charcoal. To begin with, I was blindly always buying horticultural charcoal because it's something that I could very easily find at Bunnings, but I didn't fully understand why it needed to be horticultural charcoal. Now that I've done a little bit more research, I'd love to share why it does need to be horticultural charcoal. So as far as I can think, your other options would be barbecue charcoal or filtering charcoal or activated charcoal. The reason we wouldn't use barbecue charcoal is that it's full of fillers, which are nearly all chemicals, which aren't going to benefit your plant or you or anyone in that situation. So there's no, just forget the barbecue charcoal. Another one that I think that people can swap out horticultural charcoal for is filtering charcoal. That's mostly used for aquariums as far as I know. This charcoal actually isn't even made from wood, which isn't a great start, but as well as that, it goes through many chemical washes to become the product that needs to be for an aquarium, which again, those chemicals are never going to benefit your plants. Filtering charcoal also holds on to way more water than horticultural charcoal, and quite honestly, that's almost the opposite reason that I add horticultural charcoal to my soil. So I would never find that helpful for me. Horticultural charcoal is unprocessed, untreated, and as far as I know, the most natural option. There's a myth that adding a horticultural charcoal to your soil mixes will eliminate any sort of odors from your plant. For one, I'm not sure what odors people are having from the soil in their pots. If your houseplant soil is having a bad odor, I would think that it's time to change the soil. To me, that sounds icky and like something isn't going right. Activated charcoal is far spongier and has far more air pockets that absorb odors. Horticultural charcoal doesn't have that, so it's not going to have any effect on odors. Another myth that I've seen is that people will add horticultural charcoal to the soil to try and help as an antifungal product, but charcoal is not going to be the most helpful product for that problem. You're far more likely to have better results from sulfur or copper products that are aimed for houseplants rather than adding horticultural charcoal. So what does charcoal do then? Charcoal does increase the pH of the soil slightly, which again can be very helpful for plants that love that. But as well as that, it helps the plants with their uptake of nutrients. Adding horticultural charcoal to your soil may double the calcium uptake, significantly increase the potassium, magnesium and phosphorus uptake, which is incredibly helpful. For me, the reason I add it to my soil is to be able to add some aeration to my soil. It's in bigger chunks than perlite, which I'll get to in a moment, but being these bigger chunks means that there's more aeration happening. It also doesn't erode or break down or rot at all as you water your plants more and more and more. Things like perlite that are super light will rise to the top of your pot, which then the rest of your pot doesn't have that aeration. Charcoal isn't going to move. Also, just personally, I don't think I've seen anyone else mention this, so I don't know if this is super wrong, but I've seen a lot of people use things like coffee filters and pieces of mesh that they'll lay over the drainage hole inside the pot so that the soil can't run out and make a big mess out of the drainage hole. I use a piece of charcoal. I'll pick a big old chunky piece of charcoal out of my bag and I'll pop it right over that drainage hole. That way I know that soil's not just going to run out and make a big mess, and I don't know, being charcoal, I'm not worried about it sitting there holding on to moisture and making the feet of my plant wet. Okay, so perlite, seeing as I mentioned that in the last category, probably should come next. So perlite is this volcanic rock that is heated and crushed until it explodes and you end up with these little tiny white balls that quite frankly look and kind of feel like styrofoam. It has a medium water retention rating and a low nutrient rating. So it also has a neutral pH and it will not rot or erode, but like I mentioned earlier, over time perlite is going to rise to the top of your soil. Something I'll add on that, I do find that the perlite rising to the top of my pot only becomes a massive issue at about the 2-year range. Obviously depending on what type of plant it is, so how often I'm watering it. But I find that by the time the perlite has all risen to the top, it's about time for me to change the soil out anyway, so my plant's getting enough nutrients. So I don't know that I find that quite as much of an issue as it's made out to be. Oh my god. Now the past on my wall is being noisy. Okay, so what I was saying is that a really interesting point that I read about perlite that I didn't know before this was that perlite helps to insulate the roots against extreme temperatures, extreme cold, extreme hot. The perlite is there to maintain this neutral sort of temperature between the two, which I find very interesting and very helpful to know. As I mentioned before, I live in a really cold climate. Okay, so the next product is vermiculite, and I think vermiculite and perlite get interchanged a little bit. So vermiculite I find super interesting for one. It's also probably my favorite propagation technique. Vermiculite took a lot of different Googling to understand exactly what it was, but here I am trying to relay the explanation that I finally think I understood, hopefully. So vermiculite is a group of hydrated laminar minerals. Now if you don't know what laminar means, because I sure as heck did not, laminar literally just means a thin layer of sedimentary rock or organic matter. So again, vermiculite is a group of hydrated laminar minerals. These minerals in question are magnesium, aluminium, and iron silicates. Silicates was another word. I don't know what the heck that means. Oh my god, I love trucks. Why is it so busy tonight? Silicates are a salt in which the negatively charged ion contains both silicon and oxygen. So horticultural vermiculite is processed with extreme heat, which then expands those laminar or thin slices into accordion-shaped pellets. It does not erode or mold. It has a neutral pH depending on where it's been sourced and sort of farmed around the globe. Vermiculite is considered to have better water retention than perlite, but also less aeration than perlite, which is why I would like to use a little bit of both. So the next product that I use is orchid bark, but I have to admit, more often than not, I find myself buying an orchid mix rather than straight orchid bark. I find that a little bit harder to come by. Orchid bark itself would obviously just be bark. Usually that's farmed from fir or pine trees. An orchid mix is going to be completely different brand to brand as well as country to country, but generally orchid mix is going to contain those pieces of bark from the fir or pine tree, as well as peat moss or slow release fertilizer balls or coconut husks, sometimes even perlite. So an orchid mix is going to be very different, and I encourage you to just read the label and try and find out as much as you can about what's inside that mix. So one of the great things about orchid bark and why orchids specifically love orchid bark, as well as a fair amount of indoor plants, is that epiphytic plants that I've talked about before on my channel that tend to grow on the bark on the outside of trees in the wild are going to love having this bark in their potting mix, so that the roots have something to grow around and to grip onto, just like they would in the wild. So just like the perlite and the vermiculite, orchid bark is going to give you more aeration in your potting soil. It's going to give you these pockets of air because roots need oxygen. But it's also going to have an amount of water retention. Orchid bark is going to hold on to water, and I guess the downfall of orchid bark would be that it does erode and decompose over time. Again though, I'm not finding that it's decomposing very much in the 2 years that I would let a plant sit in a pot anyway. So I don't find that to be a huge problem, but it's something to note. The pH isn't something I feel like I can comment on for orchid bark or orchid mix. The pH and the amount of nutrients is going to be so dependent on which area in the globe you live in, which brand of orchid bark slash mix that you're buying. It's so varied that there's no way that I could guess that. So the last thing and the newest thing that I've started adding to my soil mixtures is worm castings. Worm castings I think sounds a little bit fancy, but don't be fooled. It's just worm poo. Ideally, you know, if your plants were living in the wild, they're gonna have these worms that come through that eat up fungus and bacteria and mold and then release these beneficial, helpful fertilizers through their poopy. But I'm personally just not about to chuck a bunch of worms into my pots. I don't, nope, I can't even think about it. I do not vibe with worms. I've also read that using worm castings could on some level result in having worms in your pot, because there's a chance that there might be a worm egg in with those worm castings. Ooh, I am not looking forward to the day. But in the meantime, I think that it's more beneficial than not. In addition to the NPK, just standing for nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Oh my goodness, my brain struggled to compute that. Okay, so in addition to the NPK liquid nutrients that you should be, and I hope you kind of are, giving your plants, at least in the growing seasons or while your plants are growing, your plants do need other nutrients and beneficial bacteria. Things like zinc, copper, iron, carbon, all these things can be found within worm castings. Worm castings is going to be one of the most natural additives to fertilizer that I think you'll find. So it helps to feed soil microorganisms that produce, store and release plant nutrients. I did read that worm castings added to soil can help prevent against things like root rot and pests. I tried to look into those claims more because those claims were just sort of laid everywhere without anything to back them up. The only thing that I could find is that the worm castings can degrade and corrode at the protective barrier or layer around some pests. So I can see how it can be helpful for some pests. I couldn't work out why there's such a claim for it to be able to help with root rot. Great if it does. I mean, that's my biggest fear, so I would love if worm castings are going to help with root rot, but I couldn't seem to work out how it helped with root rot. So if for whatever reason your plant or your soil would be experiencing extreme pH levels, whether that be super acidic or super alkaline, leaning too severely either way is going to make it very hard for your plant's roots to soak up its nutrients. One of the pros of using worm castings is that it can act as a barrier around the roots in these extreme circumstances to be able to help the plant absorb these nutrients. So they are all the ingredients I use to mix up my soil mixture. Okay, so as I was mixing up my own potting soil, I did realize that I forgot to mention one last product. I only use one little scoop. I'll show you. I tend to use this jar as my scoop. I only use about 1 or 2, maybe 3 scoops of this little jar into my whole big tub. So it's not very much at all, but it does give that little bit of extra nutrients. The only thing that I look for is something organic. Now in terms of ratios, I really definitely do not have one. I'm just looking for the end result, so I will eyeball the amount of products that I'm putting in, and then once I've mixed it all up, I will adjust if I need to. So what I'm looking for here is that a really nice even balance in colors and textures. I was also using just the last of a lot of my products today, so it definitely was just whatever I had. But I'm liking the look of this soil. I would probably use this soil for most aroid mixes. I absolutely love mixing and making soil. I love the feel of it in my fingers. I love feeling a bit like a wizard, adding all these funny little ingredients into this big tub and mixing it up and knowing that it's going to create magic. So there's lots of things to keep in mind when it comes to mixing these potting mixes and making these ratios for yourself. The material that the pot is made out of is generally the first thing that I will think of. So a terracotta pot or an unglazed concrete pot is going to be super porous and absorb a lot of moisture and wick away a lot of moisture, which can be absolutely helpful for so many plants, especially if you're an overwaterer like I am. But if you're putting a soil mixture into a terracotta pot that's basically 70% perlite, you're going to find yourself watering that plant nearly every day. And I've definitely made that mistake myself before. A plastic pot or a ceramic glazed pot is going to hold on to a lot of moisture, and it's already going to take an extra long amount of time to drain that moisture out and wick that moisture away. So they're not really pots that I would be putting in peat dense soil into. Of course, the other thing to take into consideration is the actual plant that you're making the soil for. It's not very hard to do a quick Google search and find out whether or not the plant that you're using is epiphytic. A lot of house plants I find are epiphytic, which means that they really do love that orchid bark, but just not all of them are, and not all of them need that in their mix. So do a quick Google search, do some research on the plant that you've bought, understand the plant that you've bought, or just don't do that and go by trial and error. Actually, you know what? Either way, I've done both ways and I've enjoyed the process both ways. So do whatever makes you happy and take it all back. But that's just the information that I wanted to share and that I think I found helpful over time, and I think I would have found helpful from the beginning. So yes, I think that's all I have to say about the ingredients in my soil mixtures. I hope you enjoy making your own soil mixtures. I really do. It's half the fun of bringing a plant home for me. But like I said, even if that's not your jam and that's just way too much work, way too much thinking, way too many products to buy, I would still encourage you to buy at least one amendment to add to a typical potting mix. So, thanks a ton for watching my video. I really appreciate it if you made it all the way to the end. If you have the time to like, subscribe or comment, I would so appreciate it. It really does help my channel out in terms of being found by new people on YouTube. It helps with the algorithm, the big mysterious algorithm. But thank you regardless. Alright, I'm running out of words. Bye.